Welcome in to a new series at Soccer Down Here called Soccer Files. My name is Jason Longshore, and we'll be digging into the history of soccer in the United States, in the South, in the Atlanta area, throughout this podcast series. Thanks for being a subscriber to Soccer Down Here and checking this out. Please spread the word. And if you have any suggestions on topics that you'd like to see us cover, tweet at us at Soccer Down Here. Send us an email, soccerdownhere@gmail.com. Unfortunately, our first edition of Soccer Files is a sad one. On Wednesday evening, March 25th, Bill Bartholomay passed away in the New York area. Bill Bartholomay is best known as the owner of the Braves baseball franchise and moved them from Milwaukee to Atlanta. His soccer history is not as long as his association with baseball, but very, very important, and we'll get into that just a bit here on this episode. Make sure you check out the great piece at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution today from Tim Tucker, digging into Bartholomay's impact on not just baseball in Atlanta, but baseball as a whole. He was very involved even after he sold the Braves franchise to Ted Turner in 1976. Very involved in the ownership committee of Major League Baseball, even in fairly recent years. He was last at spring training for the Atlanta Braves, and pretty much all of the Braves' meaningful moments in their history since they moved to Atlanta, Bill Bartholomay was there. He also was the man who took a chance on starting a soccer franchise in Atlanta, a city that had no history with the game really to speak of. If you go back to some of our friend Patrick Sullivan's great work covering what happened in Atlanta soccer in the 1910s and the 1920s, by the time the Braves moved to Atlanta ahead of the 1966 season for Major League Baseball, you didn't really have any kind of a soccer scene in Atlanta. So for Bartholomay to take the chance after taking the chance in moving the franchise to Atlanta in the first place, and a lot of people told him that it would fail, to take on another risk and bring in a sport that had never seen a nationwide professional league at this point, in a city that had no soccer culture to build on, it was incredibly risky and ultimately was ahead of its time. And while that's the case, it is very important that the effort was made, because those seeds that were planted, and there were some very strategic, important decisions made to plant seeds, and this was something that not every team did at this time, they paid off in later generations, and we've seen soccer grow to the point that, in my opinion, and I think the opinion of quite a few around the country, Atlanta is the epicenter of soccer in the United States at the moment. That wouldn't have happened if Bill Bartholomay hadn't taken that chance back in 1966. A little bit of background. William C. Bartholomay was born in August of 1928. He grew up just outside of Chicago, spent most of his life in the insurance business. His father and his grandfather were also successful in the insurance brokerage business. In 1962, the Milwaukee Braves were sold to a group that was led by Bartholomay, based in Chicago, and $6.2 million in 1962. That's how much it cost to buy the Milwaukee Braves, who had only been in Milwaukee for 9 years at the time. You could already start to see that maybe Milwaukee was a smaller market than the original Boston Braves had thought that it was when they moved there. After the World Series runs in 1957 and 58, attendance started to drop and revenue started to drop more than anything. Also, alongside of that, you had Atlanta growing and becoming a city that wanted to be recognized among the biggest and most important in the United States. One way you do that is you have Major League Sports. And Atlanta became very aggressive in the early 60s in trying to bring Major League Sports to the city. Bartholomay said it was the 1963 Major League Baseball All-Star Game in Cleveland that an Atlanta delegation came to meet Major League Baseball owners and wanted to make it very clear that the city was going to build a 50,000-seat stadium, and they were going to do it even if they didn't have a team yet. They were that serious about getting big-time sports in the South. Bartholomay said in 2015 that Atlanta was going to take the lead in a lot of things, the new economy and the new South and whatnot, and part of that was professional sports. To make about a $20 million commitment to build a stadium on spec with no team involved was pretty gutsy, to say the least. You had two teams at that time in Major League Baseball that had stadium leases that were about to run out. It was the Braves and the Cleveland Indians. The folks from Atlanta made it clear they wanted a National League team. Seemed to make sense. They kept working on a deal. They kept pushing. Things were not going well in Milwaukee, and the Braves Board of Directors voted 12-6 in October of 1964 to move the team from Milwaukee to Atlanta. Now, it was held up with a legal challenge. They had to play a lame duck season in 1965 in Milwaukee. The stadium was done ahead of the 1965 season. The Atlanta Crackers minor league team played in the Atlanta Stadium at the time in 1965 before the Braves came to town to start the 1966 season. Well, right around that time, in early 1966, you had a lot of things bubbling up about professional soccer and a nationwide league in the United States that had never been done before. You'd had a regional league in the Northeast called the American Soccer League. You had different leagues out west that involved Canadian cities as well. You had lots of different initiatives. Bill Cox had the International Soccer League, which brought over foreign teams to play in a league format in the summer in the New York area, and he was experimenting with games in Chicago and St. Louis and Los Angeles. And things were starting to happen. It was early 1966, after the Braves got into Atlanta, that things started to happen on the soccer front in Atlanta. It was May 9th that the Atlanta Braves submitted a $1,000 check as an option to purchase a team in the North American Professional Soccer League. Now, we'll get into this on Soccer Files as we go, but you had multiple groups that wanted to start a league in 1966, and there was quite a debate about how the United States Soccer Football Association at the time, the USSFA, would handle sanctioning a league. Ultimately, one league of the three was sanctioned. The other two merged after they didn't get the sanctioning. Bartholomay and the Braves team was in one of the leagues that did not get sanctioning. They merged to create the National Professional Soccer League, and on August 9th, that league was introduced to the public. Now, this was the league that did not have official sanctioning, so talk about risk. This was a pretty big risk to make this happen, but Bartholomay, one, wanted dates in the stadium. Two, he believed that soccer could be a big thing. He had just returned from London from the World Cup final. Himself and Arthur Montgomery spent time in England during the World Cup. That convinced them that this was going to be something that he wanted to be a part of. This clip right here is from the WSB archives at the Walter J. Brown Media Archives at the University of Georgia, and it's Bill Bartholomay speaking to WSB sports director Carl Sell in August of 1966 about why he wanted to get involved in soccer at the time.
Good afternoon. We're standing in the Braves clubhouse where the current style of shoe is that of baseball. It'll soon be football, and now they tell us that soon it will be soccer. Standing with me is Bill Bartholomay, chairman of the board of the Braves, and Bill, tell us about it.
Well, Carl, we're very excited about it. The Braves have decided to go into soccer with 8 other cities, and we're going in a major way because Atlanta is a major league city in football and baseball, and we hope it will be in soccer. In my opinion, it's just a question of time until soccer has attained the popularity in this country as it has in virtually every other place in the world, and if we can reach that goal, then of course we want Atlanta to be part of it.
Bartholomay told the Atlanta Journal-Constitution at the time that this is a new venture and we are just feeling our way now, but we have to believe that it has much potential and we are very happy to have a part in it. Much of the organizational work still has to be worked out, including the decision on when the season will open, acquiring coaches and players, etc., but we'll just take it a step at a time along with the rest of them. Now, one of Bartholomay's key moves at this point, he made two in quick succession in early September, was hiring Dick Cecil. Dick Cecil had been with the Braves organization in a number of roles. He was really put in charge of organizing and creating the soccer team from scratch. One of Cecil's first hires that Bartholomay signed off on was hiring Phil Woosnam as player/coach/general manager/everything. And the three of them all worked together to create, I think, a different idea on how to do a soccer club in the United States. A lot of the other cities that were involved in the NPSL and in the competing league that was sanctioned, the United Soccer Association, were in cities that had large ethnic populations, and they tried to play off of that, or they hired soccer people who built a team in their image, from players from their country, for example. The Atlanta team that didn't have a name at this point really set along a path of creating a soccer culture because they didn't have anything to play off of. And Bartholomay, Cecil, and Woosnam all were on the same page about how important education would be, how important community outreach would be, and how important it would be to just introduce the sport to not just Atlanta, but cities and towns all over the Southeast. That was a key element of what all three of them did in creating what eventually became the Atlanta Chiefs. Now, another key role that Bill Bartholomay played in the early days of professional soccer in the United States was he was a key figure in the NPSL's television committee. He served alongside Robert Herman, who was the league president, John Pinto of RKO General and the New York Generals, and ended up getting a national contract from CBS TV for a sport that had no real history of being on TV on a national basis. One of the first nationally broadcast matches was just a few months prior to this, the World Cup final from England in 1966, which was beamed over on a short tape delay on satellite. The ratings were really good. The interest was really good. The excitement level was high. And the NPSL, along with Bartholomay, had a number of very influential, important folks in American sports. And that was enough to convince CBS to commit to a game of the week and a 10-year deal. Now, ultimately, that 10-year contract was not picked up on options because the league struggled, and eventually the league failed, and it nearly went away. But Atlanta was one of the cities that kept it alive to get to that next generation of the North American Soccer League, and the commitment from Bill Bartholomay was very, very important. 1967 is when the team actually got onto the field. They were named the Chiefs. That played off of the Atlanta Braves, obviously. And one of the early investments that Bill Bartholomay undertook that was very important in, I think, creating a culture in Atlanta that was accepting of soccer, and maybe more accepting of soccer than a lot of other cities at the time, was he took most of the media members in Atlanta to London, and they went to first have a bunch of different meetings with folks about soccer, but also to see a game. And they went to the Bowling Ground, and they saw West Ham play. And this was such an important thing for Bill Bartholomay to first commit to paying for it, because it wasn't exactly cheap in those days, but to, I think, explain what he hoped soccer would be in the Atlanta area. So that trip, when you go back and look at that trip and who went on it, it was Bartholomay, it was Dick Cecil, it was Phil Woosnam. You had members of the Braves and Chiefs front office, but you had members of the media like Jesse Outler, who wrote very positively about soccer for a number of years. Furman Bisher, very incredibly well-respected member of the Atlanta Journal staff. Marian Jackson of the Atlanta Daily World. And one of the funny stories I've talked to Dick Cecil about is Marian Jackson was often mistaken for Sonny Liston in London. Had kind of that build, so I can somewhat see it. They also took Milo Hamilton, who was an announcer for first WSB, but also for the Atlanta Braves at that time. A figure that a lot of people know who follow college football in the South, Larry Munson, Art Collier, who was associated with Georgia Tech. This was a very expensive trip, and it was a very important thing in, I think, changing some of the perception about soccer, and also, I think, just explaining, what it could be. Jesse Outler wrote after watching this, he said, English football fans, Woosnam says only Americans call it soccer, are as unbiased as Tech and Georgia football fans. They exhibit the same enthusiasm that Georgians display when the state championship is decided in Athens or Atlanta. He said, frankly, I had wondered whether soccer would succeed in the United States until I arrived at Bowling Ground. Now I'm convinced that within 3 or 4 years, the game will prove popular indeed. Outler was a little ahead of his time in that. It did take a little bit longer, and it was tough. It was tough to put in all the time in building a club from scratch, to go out and to do camps and clinics. In 1967, the first year of the club, the Atlanta Chiefs, according to Phil Woosnam in an interview at the end of that year, they did 390 clinics in 1967, served over 20,000 kids and coaches. They organized clinics to teach coaches, to teach referees, to basically train the first referees in the state of Georgia. You didn't have a Georgia State Soccer Association. That was formed in 1967. You didn't have an amateur league. That was formed in 1967, the Atlanta District Amateur Soccer League. You had 8 high school teams that were fielding soccer teams in 1967. By 1968, that was 42. You had youth leagues that had never existed in the Atlanta area get started. The Decatur YMCA continues on today. Walter Gray started with the Soccer Youth League of Georgia in DeKalb County. So many people who came out of that first era then went on to coach and to be involved in the college game and to be involved as professionals later on. I mean, it was so important for the game to get its start right here. And a lot of that investment came from Bill Bartholomay, because he realized that, one, it was going to take time, and 2, it was necessary for this to have a chance to succeed. Now, 1967, the Chiefs were number 2 in the NPSL in attendance. People responded pretty well. It was still a tough go. Atlanta was not the city that it is now. Didn't have the international community that it has now, so it was tough. 1968, the team won the championship, and that's a huge part of Atlanta soccer history, but maybe even more important was the fact that they hosted Manchester City in a pair of matches that the Atlanta Chiefs won. They hosted Pelé and Santos in a match that the Chiefs lost, but all 3 of those drew over 20,000 fans. And I think that convinced Bartholomay, it convinced Dick Cecil, it convinced the Braves as an organization to keep going. Now, not many teams in 1967 and 1968 had the wherewithal to keep going. The league collapsed down to 5 teams going into 1969, and Bartholomay stuck with it. And one reason that he stuck with it, and he mentioned this late in 1968, was the 16,000 kids at that time who not took part in a clinic like they did in 1967, but were playing in leagues It had went from an introduction of the game in a clinic and a one-off to kids practicing, playing games, being part of a league format that quickly. And that was one of the things that convinced him to keep going. Now, by continuing on, it kept professional soccer alive in the United States. And as we know, the NASL steadily grew and steadily grew. Well, the Chiefs weren't there to see that next level of growth under Bill Bartholomay's leadership. The Chiefs had to bow out of the league after the 1972 season. It was announced that they lost more than $1.5 million over 5 years. They were not in a position to justify that kind of loss. The Braves were not really in a position where they were making much money either, and that was the primary business. So it just, all those seeds that were planted, it wasn't time for them to bloom yet. I think another reason why, and you could see it a few years later, the partners that owned the Braves, Bartholomay was the head of that group, the enthusiasm for that investment kind of waned a bit over the years. The Braves weren't winning. It wasn't what I think they hoped it would be. And by 1976, some of them wanted out, and Bartholomay's group sold the Braves to Ted Turner for $11 million in 1976, and he stayed involved with the Braves as a chairman of the board, as a chairman emeritus, as I mentioned earlier, in many, many different baseball committees, serving Major League Baseball. Bud Selig, who was heartbroken when the Braves left Milwaukee and then went on to be involved in the Brewers, and then being a commissioner of Major League Baseball, talked about just, how great of a figure in baseball Bill Bartholomay was. He was a very important figure in American sports, not even just baseball, but in Atlanta, his commitment to bring Major League sports to town was critical in Atlanta's growth and turning into the city that it is today. The Falcons came not too long after the Braves. The Hawks came a few years later, but it was in the soccer world, Bill Bartholomay taking a chance on a sport that he really didn't have any history with, in a city that didn't have any history with it, and it was absolutely 100% ahead of its time. Under Ted Turner's leadership, the Chiefs returned in 1979. The league, by that point, the North American Soccer League, was on the downswing. Business had kind of bottomed out. It didn't work. 1981, Ted Turner pulled the plug on Chiefs 2.0, and one big reason why was he needed as much investment and capital and time as he could put into a little thing called CNN, which ended up becoming a pretty big thing. And the North American Soccer League folded after the 1984 season. Fast forward to what we've seen with Atlanta United. I've said it many times, and I think it's important to say it again here. Atlanta United does not have the success that it has without the seeds that were planted during the original Atlanta Chiefs days. And so much of that is down to the investment, the commitment that Bill Bartholomay put into delivering not just as first class of a product as he possibly could at that time, but also understanding that it was going to take significant resources to try to create a soccer culture from scratch. And ultimately he did. And ultimately everything branches off of that original Atlanta Chiefs that is still going in soccer in Atlanta today. You have the professional game thriving. You have the youth game thriving. You have a state association. You have an adult league that is older than many in the southeastern part of the United States. You have institutions that have been around since those days, and so many people who saw their first soccer game, kicked their first soccer ball, went to their first camp, played in their first league because of those Atlanta Chiefs, and ultimately because of the risk that Bill Bartholomay took, and it paid off. And I really hope that he knew that what happened much later than the Atlanta Chiefs. The optimism of him, of Dick Cecil, of Phil Woosnam, of Jesse Outler, that optimism was a little early. But I hope that he knew that he was on the right path, and all of that investment and all of that time and all of those seeds ended up creating something incredibly special with Atlanta United. And I hope that he knew that. I have a feeling that he did. We were actually hoping to sit down with Bill Bartholomay in the upcoming months as we're working on some different soccer projects. And I am very sad that I don't get the chance to meet him and thank him for taking that risk that he did in 1966 and putting down a $1,000 check on an option for a team in a league that ended up turning into a lot of different things than it was originally intended to. It was a pretty wild ride for the early Atlanta Chiefs, and we'll be digging deeper into that and many other things on Soccer Files as we go here on the SDH network. But a very sad day in the sports world, in the baseball world, in the Atlanta sports scene, honestly, in Atlanta as a whole, and in the American soccer world as well. Bill Bartholomay, the original owner of the Atlanta Chiefs, passed away at the age of 91.